the promise that God makes to Abraham, in part, is that if you fall into that pattern of maximal adventure and courageous movement forward, that your life is imbued with a meaning that transcends time, and that you embody something like an archetypal and eternal spirit. And that's the spirit of the Father. That's why Abraham understands that he's made contact with the God of his ancestors. And if you're a good father, you have that spirit dwelling within you. And the Christian insistence is that that spirit's identical to the Logos that bears the weight of the world on its shoulders voluntarily. And that's what brings everything into being. Stunning. It's a stunning conceptualization. And I think it's right. It looks right to me. And the idea that sacrifice is the basis of the community, that's just obvious. Like the fact that you're married. So what's the sacrificial gesture there? Well, all other women. That's sacrifice number one. Then it's not about you. It's also not about your wife. It's about the stability of your union across time. And it's about the stability of that union insofar as that's a reliable foundation for your children. So that's sacrificial too. You give up your whims in the present so that the future's stabilized. You give up your immaturity so that your children can thrive. That's all sacrificial gesture. And we figured that out. That's why we put the crucifix at the center of our society. Because we figured out, even though we didn't know it, we figured out that the stability of the community is predicated on the willingness of the individual to sacrifice. And the exploration in the New Testament is the limits of sacrifice, right?
So do you think that that's what people think of when they think of the cross?
It's very hard to think about. Very hard to know what people think about. I would say it depends on their level of sophistication.
Right, that's what I'm getting at. Yeah. I don't think it's ever been explained to me that way, and I don't think most people think about it that way when they think about it. They think Jesus died for our sins. There he is. Praise Jesus.
Right.
It's a very
formulaic,
surface level understanding of what it is we're talking about. Well, I think it's partly because
it's partly, and there's a merciful element of it, and this is what Jung was referring to when he said that religion helps protect people against religious experience. The full revelation of the significance, let's say, of the imitation of Christ, which is supposed to be the foundation of Christian belief, is in fact the demand that you walk the same pathway. And that's it's the most terrifying demand, because so Jung described the Christian passion as an archetypal tragedy. Now, there was a reason for that. So you think about it this way, think about it technically. So imagine that 100 great storytellers told the most painful possible story. And then imagine that you aggregated all those stories and you distilled them into one story where all the terrible elements were present. Okay, so now you have a representation of the worst life can throw at you. Okay, so let's take that apart a bit. So the first thing that makes a tragedy tragic is that the tragedy befalls a good person. Because if a tragedy befalls a villain, it's just justice. It's not a tragedy. So it has to be a good person. So then to amplify that, you would not only have the tragedy befall a good person, you'd have it befall a good person that everyone knew was good, but was not only good, was the best, and that was persecuted because he was good. So that sort of limits it out in that direction. And then you might say, well, what does he have to face? Well, and the answer would be, well, the worst life has to offer. Okay, early death, early painful death, early painful, humiliating, unjust death at the hands of his friends, at the hands of the mob, under the thumb of a tyrant. Right. Brought about by people who knew that he was not only good, but the best of men. That's an archetypal tragedy. And then it doesn't limit out. So then you have the death that occurs in consequence of that and its voluntary acceptance. But that's not where it ends, because the mythology surrounding the crucifixion story insists that Christ harrowed hell after the crucifixion, which meant that he confronted not only death, but malevolence itself, and in consequence transcended both. And so what's the underlying psychological message? It's something like the calling and the voice of conscience, informing people that in order to thrive properly in life and to become who you could be, if you could be everything you could be, you have to voluntarily take on the weight of the worst life has to offer, including the depths of malevolence itself. And you think, well, obviously, Joe, you know this. Like, how are you going to adapt to a situation you won't even admit to?
Right.
Well, so how could it be otherwise than for you to become everything that you could be, you have to embrace all of the catastrophes that life has to offer? Like, how could it be other than that? You're going to hide? You're going to pretend?
Right.
How's that going to work? No one thinks that'll work.
Right.
And so, and you're right, there is this defensive element to particularly the Protestant religious tradition, although I don't want to single out the Protestants specifically, that insists that, the work has already been done. But there's a lot of ambivalence about that in the Christian canon, because there's an equal insistence that, no, you're supposed to take all this on voluntarily. And that not only that, it's such an interesting idea because it makes so much sense psychologically. So imagine that as your courage grows so that you can confront more and more of the horror of life, that a spirit begins to develop within you that gives you a strength that's commensurate with your daring. That's walking with God. That's the same thing. So the promise is that if you had the courage, something would be with you to allow you to bear up nobly under the burden. And all the clinical evidence supports that proclamation, because what you see in people in the therapeutic transformation is that insofar as they're willing to confront what terrifies them voluntarily, they get stronger. And then imagine that there's nothing but a metaphysical limit to that. And I think that's right. I can't see how it cannot be right.
It makes sense, and it resonates with how we know people that have overcome great things in their life and become these very unusual and unique people.